In the grim darkness of the far future, there are horrors that even the Inquisition dare not speak aloud. Whispers in the shadows tell of worlds where reality itself bends to unspeakable desires, where entire populations have fallen to temptations so vile that death, were we dealt, be a mercy. Today, if into the most insidious corruption the galaxy has ever known, the seductive embrace of Slaanesh, and the terrifying truth behind what happens when entire worlds fall to the Dark Prince of Chaos. What I'm about to reveal to you has been hidden in the deepest vaults of the Inquisition for good reason. These are not tales for the faint of heart, but accounts of real worlds, real people, and real horrors that demonstrate just how far the tendrils of chaos can reach. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the Imperium's response to Slaaneshi corruption is so extreme, and why some knowledge is considered too dangerous to possess. But first, let me give you the context you need to truly comprehend the magnitude of what we're discussing. Unlike the other Chaos gods who corrupt through obvious means, plague, war, or sorcery, Slaanesh operates through subtlety and seduction. This makes the Dark Prince perhaps the most dangerous of all the Chaos gods, because by the time you realize you're being corrupted, it's already far too late. The Prince of Excess didn't emerge from the warp like the other Chaos gods. No, Slaanesh was born from the collective depravity of an entire species, the ancient Eldar Empire, whose pursuit of perfection and pleasure ultimately created the very entity that would consume them. This was so birth catastrophic that it tore a permanent wound in realities itself, creating the Eye of Terror and damning countless worlds to eternal torment. What makes Slaanesh truly terrifying is not just the corruption itself, but how it spreads. Where Khorne demands obvious bloodshed and Nurgle brings visible decay, Slaanesh works through whispered promises and gradual seduction. A noble seeking greater political influence, an artist pursuing the perfect masterpiece, a warrior striving for flawless technique, all can become gateways for the Dark Prince's influence without the victim even realizing what's happening. The corruption begins innocuously enough. Perhaps it's a secret club promising freedom from the constraints of imperial doctrine, or a mysterious patron offering to elevate your work to new heights of perfection. Maybe it's simply the desire to experience something, the grinding beyond monotony of hive world existence. These seemingly innocent desires become the cracks through which corruption seeps into the soul. Consider the case of Malfidon Prime, a hive world that seemed to exemplify imperial order and efficiency. The first signs of corruption appeared in the upper spires, among the nobility who had grown bored with their privileged existence. A charismatic figure known only as the Velvet Magistrate began hosting exclusive gatherings for the elite, promising experiences beyond anything they had previously imagined. These gatherings started as elaborate dinner parties with exotic foods and entertainment from across the sector. The guests due to performances by artists who pushed the boundaries of conventional aesthetics, musicians whose compositions seemed to be treated to touch something deep within the listener's soul, and dancers whose movements were hypnotically beautiful. Nothing overtly heretical occurred during these early events, yet something fundamental was changing in the attendees. The transformation was subtle at first. The nobles who attended these gatherings began to display an increasing dissatisfaction with their normal lives. Their appetite for conventional pleasures diminished, while their hunger for more exotic experiences grew. They started to seek out increasingly rare and expensive items, not for their material value, but for the unique sensations they provided. As weeks passed, the gatherings became more frequent and more elaborate. The entertainment grew more extreme, pushing the boundaries of taste and decency further with each event. The guests, now thoroughly addicted to these new sensations, barely noticed how their own behavior was changing. They began to dress differently, adopting fashions that emphasized sensuality over practicality. Their speech patterns altered, becoming more flowery and seductive. The corruption spread through the noble houses like a virus, but not through direct contact. Instead, it propagated through desire and envy. Those who weren't invited to the Velvet Magistrates' gatherings desperately wanted to know what they were missing. They would do anything to gain entry to this exclusive circle, making compromises with their principles that they would have found unthinkable just months earlier. What the nobles didn't realize was that each compromise, at each small transgression, was being carefully orchestrated. The Velvet Magistrate wasn't just hosting parties. He was conducting a masterclass in gradual corruption. Every boundary that was crossed made the next transgression easier to accept. Every taboo that was broken normalized the breaking of the next one. The truly insidious aspect of this corruption was how it made the victims feel empowered and enlightened rather than debased. They believed they were transcending the crude limitations of ordinary imperial citizens, that they were becoming something greater and more refined. This sense of superiority made them evangelical about their new lifestyle, eager to share their discoveries with others who they deemed worthy of enlightenment. As the corruption deepened, the gatherings began to require more than just passive participation. The guests were encouraged to contribute to push the entertainment their own boundaries in service of the group's collective experience started as sophisticate. What conversation evolved into confession of secret desires, then into acting upon those desires in front of an appreciative audience? The psychological mechanisms at work were devastatingly effective. The human need for acceptance and belonging was weaponized against the victims. To maintain their place in this exclusive society, they had to continually prove their commitment by embracing ever more extreme behaviors. The fear of being cast out, of returning to their mundane existence, drove them to depths of depravity they would never have contemplated before. Meanwhile, the influence wasn't contained to the noble spires. The servants who worked these gatherings returned to their quarters with stories and artifacts that began to corrupt the lower levels of the hive. A stolen piece of jewelry that seemed to make its wearer irresistibly attractive, a fragment of music that haunted the listener's dreams, a perfume that awakened desires they didn't know they possessed. The corruption manifested differently at each level of society, adapting to the specific vulnerabilities and desires of different social classes. Among the factory workers, it appeared as promises of escape from their backbreaking labor through substances that provided transcendent experiences. For the enforcers, it offered the intoxicating power of absolute authority without consequences. Each group was approached through their particular weaknesses, but all were being led toward the same ultimate destination. By the time the planetary authorities realized something was amiss, the corruption had already established deep roots throughout the hive's social structure. The investigation that was launched quickly ran into obstacles as many of the investigators found themselves compromised by the very network they were trying to expose. Evidence disappeared, witnesses recanted their statements, and anyone who got too close to the truth found themselves subjected to increasingly persuasive arguments about the benefits of joining rather than fighting. The genius of Slaaneshi corruption lies in its ability to make resistance seem not just futile, but foolish. Why cling to the harsh realities of imperial life when such exquisite pleasures are available? Why suffer in ignorance when enlightenment is offered so freely? The corrupted don't see themselves as fallen. They see themselves as elevated, as having discovered truths that the masses are too weak or stupid to comprehend. This transformation of perspective is perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the Dark Prince's influence. The victims don't just lose their souls, they become willing accomplices in the corruption of others. They genuinely believe they are doing good by sharing their revel others' transgressions, by helping end the limitations of ordinary existence. As we'll discover in the next part of our investigation, what happened on Malfidon Prime was only the beginning. The corruption that started in those exclusive gatherings would eventually consume the entire world, transforming it into something that defied every law of nature and sanity. But to understand how complete that transformation became, we must first examine the true nature of Slaanesh's servants and the horrifying reality of what they offer to those foolish enough to accept their gifts. The true horror of what transpired on Malfidon Prime only becomes clear when we examine the physical manifestations that began to appear as the corruption deepened. The servants of Slaanesh aren't merely cultists who have chosen a different path. They are beings who have been fundamentally altered by exposure to the Dark Prince's essence, transformed into something that can barely be called human anymore. The first documented sightings occurred in the industrial sectors where workers began displaying unusual physical characteristics. Their skin took on an unnaturally smooth, almost porcelain-like quality that seemed to glow with an inner light. Their movements became unnaturally fluid and graceful, as if they were dancing while even performing mundane tasks. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to derive intense pleasure from activities that should have been painful or exhausting. These early transformations were subtle enough to be dismissed as genetic anomalies or the effects of prolonged exposure to industrial chemicals. The affected individuals were still functional, still capable of performing their duties, and many actually showed improved productivity and enthusiasm for their work. Supervisors noted that these workers rarely complained about overtime or dangerous conditions, seeming instead to revel in challenges that would break ordinary humans. What the authorities failed to recognize was that these physical changes were merely the external symptoms of a far more profound alteration. The transformed workers weren't just experiencing enhanced physical capabilities. They were developing entirely new sensory organs that allowed them to perceive and interact with aspects of reality that remained hidden from unaltered humans. Dr. Vex Karelius, one of the few medical officers who managed to conduct detailed examinations before succumbing to corruption himself, documented these changes with clinical precision. His notes, recovered from the ruins of his laboratory, described subjects who had developed additional nerve clusters throughout their bodies, creating zones of hypersensitivity that could detect minute changes in temperature, pressure, and electromagnetic fields. More alarming still were the psychological transformations that accompanied these physical changes. The affected individuals began to display an almost supernatural ability to read the emotions and desires of those around them. They could identify a person's deepest fears, most secret longings, and most carefully guarded vulnerabilities with uncanny accuracy. This ability made them devastatingly effective at recruitment, as they could tailor their approach to each potential convert with precision that seemed almost prescient. The corruption spread through what could only be described as emotional contagion. Those who spent extended periods around the transformed individuals found themselves experiencing intense cravings for sensations they couldn't name or understand. They would wake from vivid dreams filled with impossible colors and indescribable pleasures, only to find that their mundane reality seemed increasingly gray and lifeless by comparison. As the transformation progressed, the affected individuals began to exhibit capabilities that defied conventional understanding of human biology. They could survive injuries that should have been fatal, regenerating damaged tissue at an accelerated rate. Their tolerance for pain increased dramatically, but paradoxically, so did their capacity for pleasure. They seemed to exist in a state of constant low-level euphoria that occasionally spiked into episodes of transcendent ecstasy. The most disturbing aspect of these changes was how they affected the subject's relationship with reality itself. The transformed individuals began to perceive layers of existence that were invisible to normal humans. They spoke of seeing patterns in seemingly random events, of hearing melodies in ambient noise, of detecting fragrances that carried emotional and even psychic information. These enhanced perceptions came at a terrible cost. The subjects gradually lost their ability to distinguish between their own thoughts and emotions and those of the entities that were increasingly present in their minds. They would sometimes speak in voices that weren't their own, conveying information they couldn't possibly have known through normal means. Their personalities began to fragment and merge, creating composite beings that retained memories and skills from multiple sources. The phenomenon wasn't limited to individual transformation. Groups of corrupted individuals began to exhibit collective behaviors that suggested they were operating as components of a larger, distributed consciousness. They would coordinate their actions across vast distances without any apparent means of communication, working together toward goals that none of them could articulate individually. Surveillance recordings from this period show gatherings where dozens of transformed individuals would move in perfect synchronization, their actions forming complex patterns that seemed to serve no practical purpose, but possessed an undeniable aesthetic beauty. These gatherings would last for hours, with participants entering trance-like states, during which they would perform elaborate rituals involving geometric movements, harmonic vocalizations, and the manipulation of objects in ways that created mesmerizing visual displays. What made these gatherings particularly dangerous was their effect on observers. Security personnel tasked with monitoring these activities began to report strange dreams and unexplained compulsions. Several guards were found to have abandoned their posts to stand closer to the ritual sites, apparently mesmerized by what they were witnessing. Those who watched the recordings later described feeling an almost irresistible urge to join the participants, to become part of the beautiful patterns they were creating. The corruption began to manifest in the architecture itself. Buildings in affected areas started to display subtle but persistent changes. Walls developed curves and angles that hadn't been present in the original construction plans. Lighting systems began to produce spectra that included colors that shouldn't have been visible to human eyes. The very air in these spaces seemed to shimmer with an energy that made breathing feel like an intoxicating experience. These environmental changes weren't random or chaotic. They followed patterns that seemed to be designed to enhance and amplify the psychological effects of prolonged exposure. Corridors would curve in ways that created a sense of movement even when standing still. Ceiling heights would vary in subtle rhythms that matched human breathing patterns. Surface textures would shift between smooth and rough, in patterns that stimulated nerve endings in ways that promoted relaxation and openness. The transformed individuals seemed to serve as conduits for these environmental alterations. Their presence would accelerate the rate of change in surrounding structures, as if they were unconsciously reshaping reality to match their altered perceptions. Rooms they frequented would develop acoustics that enhanced certain frequencies while dampening others, creating an auditory environment that promoted the trance states that had become central to their existence. Perhaps most terrifying was the discovery that these changes weren't limited to artificial structures. Parks and gardens in affected areas began to display similar alterations. Trees would grow in spiral patterns that created hypnotic visual effects when viewed from certain angles. Flowers would develop colors and fragrances that seemed to directly stimulate pleasure centers in the human brain. Even the local wildlife began to exhibit unusual behaviors, moving in coordinated patterns that mirrored those of the transformed humans. As we delve deeper into this investigation, we'll uncover evidence that what happened on Malphaedon Prime was not an isolated incident, but part of a galaxy-spanning pattern of corruption that threatens the very foundations of human civilization. The servants of Slaanesh aren't just individual cultists. They're components of a vast network that spans multiple worlds and dimensions, all working toward an ultimate goal that defies comprehension but promises consequences beyond imagination. The network's true scope became apparent when Inquisitor Valdris Caney arrived on Malphaedon Prime with his retinue of specially trained investigators. What they discovered in the deepest archives of the Hive's communication centers revealed a conspiracy that stretched across multiple star systems, each world connected by threads of corruption so subtle that they had remained undetected for decades. The communication logs showed patterns of seemingly innocent trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic missions that formed a web of influence spanning 17 different worlds. Art exhibitions that toured from system to system, carrying sculptures and paintings that served as focal points for corruption. Musical compositions that spread through Vox networks, their harmonic structures designed to alter brainwave patterns in listeners. Even perfumes and cosmetics distributed through legitimate commercial channels, each containing trace amounts of substances that heightened sensory perception and lowered psychological barriers. Caney's team discovered that the corruption network operated on principles that seemed to mock the very foundations of imperial administration. Where the Imperium relied on rigid hierarchies and clear chains of command, the servants of Slaanesh created fluid structures that adapted and evolved based on the specific vulnerabilities of each target population. Their recruitment methods were tailored not just to individual psychology, but to the cultural and social dynamics of entire worlds. On agri-worlds, the corruption manifested through harvest festivals that gradually incorporated rituals celebrating abundance and fertility in increasingly explicit ways. The seasonal celebrations that had once honored the Emperor's provision became opportunities for indulgence that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Workers who spent their days in backbreaking labor found themselves drawn to nighttime gatherings where they could experience pleasures that made their daily struggles seem worthwhile. The genius of this approach was its ability to corrupt traditional imperial values rather than directly opposing them. The festivals still honored productivity and community, but these concepts were gradually redefined to include behaviors that would have been condemned as heretical if introduced suddenly. The transformation was so gradual that participants couldn't identify the moment when their celebrations crossed the line from devotion to depravity. Industrial worlds experienced corruption through different vectors entirely. Here, the servants of Slaanesh exploited the monotony and alienation inherent in factory life. They introduced substances that enhanced focus and endurance, allowing workers to achieve states of flow that made repetitive tasks feel almost meditative. The enhanced productivity was welcomed by overseers, who failed to notice that the workers were also developing an addiction to the transcendent states these substances provided. The corruption on these worlds often manifested through what appeared to be improvements in working conditions. Factories that had been notorious for their harsh environments suddenly became models of efficiency and worker satisfaction. The air filtration systems were upgraded to include aromatics that promoted calm and focus. The lighting was adjusted to spectra that enhanced mood and alertness. Even the ambient noise was modified to include subsonic frequencies that induced mild euphoria. Workers. These improved facilities reported unprecedented job satisfaction and productivity. They would arrive early and stay late, not because they were forced to, but because they genuinely enjoyed their work. The factory floors became social spaces where workers would share stories, songs, and experiences that created bonds deeper than mere professional relationships. Management celebrated these developments as evidence of successful morale initiatives, never suspecting that they were witnessing the early stages of collective corruption. Hive worlds presented the most complex challenges for Slaaneshi infiltration, but also the greatest opportunities. The vast populations and intricate social structures created countless points of entry for corruption, each requiring different approaches, but all ultimately serving the same goal. The servants of the Dark Prince demonstrated remarkable adaptability in their methods, crafting unique strategies for each social stratum. Among the Underhive populations, corruption spread through the distribution of new recreational drugs that provided not just temporary escape from harsh realities, but genuine enhancement of sensory experience. Users reported that colors became more vivid, music more emotionally resonant, and physical sensations more intense. Unlike traditional narcotics that dulled perception, these substances seemed to unlock hidden capacities for appreciation and enjoyment. The Middle Hive populations were approached through cultural movements that promised to elevate their aesthetic sensibilities. Art galleries, music venues, and literary societies became focal points for activities that gradually pushed the boundaries of conventional taste. The participants believed they were becoming more sophisticated and culturally aware, never realizing that their expanding appreciation for beauty was being carefully guided toward forms that served the Dark Prince's purposes. The Upper Hive, corruption, followed patterns similar to those documented on Malphidon Prime, but with variations that reflected the specific power structures and social dynamics of each world. On some hives, the corruption centered around exclusive medical treatments that promised enhanced longevity and vitality. On others, it manifested through educational institutions that offered advanced training in subjects that seemed academically legitimate, but gradually introduced concepts that undermined imperial doctrine. What made these diverse approaches so effective was their ability to operate simultaneously without interfering with each other. The corruption spreading through the Underhive didn't compete with the programs targeting the nobility. Instead, they reinforced each other by creating a society-wide shift toward acceptance of previously taboo behaviors. The cumulative effect was far greater than the sum of its individual components. Kaney's investigation revealed that the coordination required for such complex operations was being provided by entities that defied conventional understanding of human organization. His team identified individuals who appeared to serve as nexus points for information and resource distribution, but these figures seemed to possess knowledge and capabilities that exceeded what any single person could reasonably accumulate. The interrogation records make for disturbing reading. Subjects would provide detailed information about operations on worlds they had never visited, demonstrate knowledge of languages they had never studied, and display familiarity with technologies that hadn't been developed yet. When pressed about the sources of their information, they would describe experiences that seemed to involve direct communication with entities existing outside normal space and time. These Nexus individuals weren't just coordon, they were conators, duets through which the will of Slaanesh itself was being expressed in the material universe. Their consciousness had been expanded beyond the limitations of individual identity, allowing them to serve as components of a distributed intelligence that could process information and coordinate actions across galactic distances instantaneously. The implications of this discovery were staggering. The Imperium's entire approach to combating chaos corruption was based on the assumption that each outbreak was a localized phenomenon that could be contained through quarantine and purification. But if the servants of Slaanesh were operating as components of a single, galaxy-spanning organism, then traditional countermeasures were not just inadequate, but potentially counterproductive. Attempts to sever the connections between corrupted worlds often resulted in the remaining nodes adapting and strengthening their bonds. Purges that eliminated identified cultists frequently led to the emergence of new leadership that was more subtle and effective than their predecessors. Even successful cleansing operations sometimes created conditions that made the affected populations more vulnerable to reinfection. The network's resilience seemed from its fundamented to derivably different organizational principles, where imperial structures relied on hierarchical command systems that could be disrupted by removing key individuals. The Slaaneshi network operated more like a living organism that could regenerate and adapt to damage. Each component was simultaneously independent and interconnected, capable of autonomous action while remaining part of a larger, coordinated effort. This organic model of organization extended to the network's growth patterns as well. Rather than expanding through conquest or conversion, it spread through a process that resembled biological reproduction. Existing nodes would gradually develop the capacity to spawn new centers of influence, seeding corruption in previously unaffected areas through methods that seemed almost unconscious. The spawn points weren't random, however. Analysis of the network's expansion patterns revealed a sophisticated understanding of imperial logistics, communication networks, and social dynamics. New corruption centers would emerge at locations that maximized their potential for further growth, while minimizing the risk of early detection. Trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and military deployment patterns all served as vectors for the spread of influence. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that the network seemed to be learning and evolving its methods based on imperial responses to previous outbreaks. Each new manifestation of corruption incorporated countermeasures against the tactics that had proven effective in earlier campaigns. The servants of Slaanesh weren't just adapting to imperial doctrine, they were actively studying and subverting it. This evolutionary capacity suggested that the corruption network possessed something resembling institutional memory that persisted across multiple outbreaks and purges. Knowledge gained through the experience of defeated cultists was somehow being preserved and transmitted to new generations of servants. The implications for long-term imperial security were dire, as it meant that every engagement with Slaaneshi corruption was potentially providing the enemy with intelligence that could be used against future operations. As our investigation continues, we'll explore the most horrifying aspect of this discovery, the realization that some of the network's most effective operatives might not even realize they're serving the Dark Prince. The corruption has become so sophisticated that it can operate through individuals who genuinely believe they're loyal imperial citizens, using their good intentions as camouflage for activities that serve the very forces they think they're fighting against. The depth of this unconscious corruption became horrifyingly apparent when Kaney's team began analyzing the personnel records of those who had been investigating the initial outbreak. What they discovered challenged every assumption about loyalty and corruption that the Imperium had held for millennia. Some of the most dedicated servants of the Emperor, individuals with spotless records of service and unwavering faith, had unknowingly become instruments of the Dark Prince's will. These unwitting agents displayed no obvious signs of corruption. Their faith remained genuine, their hatred of chaos sincere, and their dedication to imperial doctrine absolute. Yet their actions, when viewed through the lens of the network's broader objectives, served to advance Slaaneshi interests with devastating effectiveness. Their very sincerity made them more valuable to the corruption than any conscious cultist could ever be. The mechanism behind this phenomenon was as elegant as it was terrifying. Rather than corrupting these individuals directly, the network had learned to manipulate the circumstances around them. Information would be presented in ways that led to conclusions that seemed logical and righteous, but ultimately served the Dark Prince's purposes. Evidence would be arranged to point towards solutions that appeared to strengthen Imperial defenses while actually creating new vulnerabilities. Captain Mordian Voss of the Planetary Defense Force exemplified this insidious process. His record showed decades of loyal service, multiple commendations for valor, and an absolutely spotless reputation for integrity. When reports of cult activity began surfacing in his sector, he responded with characteristic diligence and thoroughness. His investigation was methodical, his conclusions seemed sound, and his recommendations appeared to address the identified threats effectively. What Voss couldn't have known was that every piece of evidence he uncovered had been carefully planted to guide his investigation along predetermined paths. The cultists he arrested were expendable assets whose capture had been planned from the beginning. The safe houses he raided contained exactly the materials needed to support the narrative that the corruption was localized and containable. The witnesses he interviewed provided testimony that reinforced his preconceptions about how chaos corruption operates. His final report recommended increased surveillance in areas that were already under Imperial control, while suggesting that certain districts could be considered secure and require less attention. These supposedly secure areas became the primary staging grounds for the network's next phase of expansion. The surveillance increases he recommended created a false sense of security that actually made it easier for corruption to spread undetected. Most damning of all, Voss's success in containing what appeared to be a significant cult outbreak elevated his reputation and authority. His methods were studied and replicated across multiple worlds, spreading the very vulnerabilities that had enabled the corruption to manipulate him in the first place. The network had effectively weaponized his competence and integrity against the Imperium itself. The pattern repeated across dozens of worlds, with variations that reflected local conditions and personalities. On Tertius Major, an ecclesiarchy preacher named Rond Ha-Castis launched a purification campaign that seemed to eliminate heretical influences while actually establishing the ritual foundations needed for deeper corruption. His fire and brimstone sermons against the temptations of chaos created an atmosphere of heightened emotional intensity that made congregants more susceptible to the very influences he was warning them about. The psychological preparation was subtle, but devastatingly effective. By focusing his congregation's attention on the nature of forbidden pleasures, Castis was inadvertently educating them about sensations and experiences they would never have imagined otherwise. His descriptions of the temptations facing the faithful served as primers for desires that lay dormant until awakened by his passionate oratory. The emotional catharsis provided by his services created states of vulnerability that the network exploited with surgical precision. Congregants would leave feeling purified and strengthened in their faith, but the intense emotional experience had actually lowered their psychological defenses. In the days following each service, they would find themselves plagued by intrusive thoughts and strange dreams that seemed to build on the imagery Castis had used in his warnings. The preacher himself remained completely unaware of the effects his sermons were having. His faith was absolute, his intentions pure, and his hatred of chaos genuine. Yet every passionate denunciation of the Dark Prince's temptations served to plant seeds of curiosity in minds that had never previously contemplated such possibilities. The network had learned to use the very strength of Imperial faith as a transmission vector for corruption. On the forge world of Metallica Secundus, Tecmagos Vex Coranis developed security protocols that seemed to perfectly address the theoretical vulnerabilities of machine systems to chaos influence. Her innovations in cognitive firewall technology and mimetic filtering were act-throughs that would protect hailed as BRE Imperial technology from the corrupting influence of scrap code and demon viruses. What Coranis didn't realize was that her research had been guided by information sources that appeared legitimate, but were actually components of the corruption network. The theoretical frameworks she used were based on studies that contained subtle flaws designed to create blind spots in her defensive systems. The security measures she developed were robust against conventional threats, but contained backdoors that could be exploited by entities operating according to different logical paradigms. Her security protocols were implemented across multiple forge worlds, creating a standardized vulnerability that the network could exploit on a massive scale. The very comprehensiveness of her solutions made them more dangerous, as administrators trusted them implicitly and reduced their vigilance in other areas. The network had effectively convinced the Mechanicus to install their own surveillance and control systems. The pattern extended beyond individual manipulation to encompass entire institutions and organizations. The Schola Progenium facility on Valhalla Prime implemented educational reforms that appeared to strengthen students' resistance to chaos corruption, while actually making them more susceptible to specific forms of influence. The curriculum changes were proposed by a committee of respected educators whose recommendations seemed to address identified weaknesses in previous training programs. The new coursework included enhanced instruction in recognizing the signs of corruption, detailed study of historical chaos outbreaks, and intensive psychological conditioning designed to strengthen mental defenses. Students who completed the revised program scored significantly higher on standard loyalty assessments and demonstrated improved resistance to conventional interrogation and coercion techniques. However, the enhanced training also created specific psychological profiles that the corruption network had learned to exploit. The students' heightened awareness of chaos threats made them more likely to notice and investigate unusual phenomena that might otherwise have been ignored. Their improved analytical skills made them valuable assets for gathering intelligence about Imperial defensive measures. Most importantly, their absolute confidence in their own corruption resistance made them less likely to recognize when they were being influenced through non-standard methods. The graduates of this program were assigned to sensitive positions throughout the sector, where they served as unwitting intelligence assets for the network. They would dutifully report anomalies and investigate suspicious activities, but their reports would be transmitted through communication channels that had been compromised at levels so deep that even the most paranoid security protocols couldn't detect the infiltration. The scope of this unconscious collaboration was staggering. Analysis of communication patterns revealed that entire administrative hierarchies had been turned into information gathering and distribution networks, without a single conscious conspirator being involved. Orders would be transmitted modified, and implemented in ways that served the corruption's purposes while appearing to strengthen Imperial defenses. Military units would be redeployed to positions that seemed strategically sound, but actually created gaps in coverage that the network could exploit. Supply lines would be optimized for efficiency in ways that made them more vulnerable to disruption. Training programs would be updated to address identified weaknesses while inadvertently creating new ones that were harder to detect. The most terrifying aspect of this systematic manipulation was its scalability. The network had developed methods for influencing decision-making processes at every level of Imperial hierarchy without requiring conscious agents at any of those levels. Lower-ranking personnel would provide accurate reports that were processed by middle management according to protocols that had been subtly modified to emphasize certain types of information while de-emphasizing others. Senior commanders would receive briefings that contained all the relevant facts, but presented them in contexts that led to predictable conclusions. Policymakers would base their decisions on comprehensive analyses that were technically accurate, but omitted crucial considerations that would have led to different choices. The entire system continued to function according to its intended design, while being systematically subverted from within. The implications for Imperial security were catastrophic. Every standard operating procedure, every security protocol, and every defensive measure could potentially be compromised without anyone involved being aware of the manipulation. The corruption had learned to exploit the very strengths of Imperial administration against itself, using the organization's efficiency and hierarchy as weapons. Worse still, the network's influence seemed to be self-reinforcing. Each successful manipulation created conditions that made future manipulation easier and more effective. Trust in compromised systems increased their authority and reach. Success stories from infiltrated operations were studied and replicated, spreading the vulnerabilities across wider areas of Imperial space. The discovery of this systematic infiltration forced a complete reevaluation of how chaos corruption operates and spreads. Traditional models assumed that corruption required conscious choice and deliberate collaboration with chaos forces. The reality was far more insidious. Corruption could be transmitted through the very systems designed to prevent it, using the good intentions and professional competence of loyal Imperial servants as vectors for influence. This revelation explained why previous anti-corruption efforts had often seemed to create new vulnerabilities, even as they addressed obvious threats. The network had learned to anticipate and exploit Imperial responses, turning each defensive measure into an opportunity for deeper infiltration. The harder the Imperium fought against corruption using conventional methods, the more sophisticated and effective that corruption became. The psychological impact on those who learned of this systematic manipulation was devastating. How could anyone trust their own judgment when the very information they used to make decisions could be compromised? How could institutions function when their most loyal and competent members might be unwitting agents of the enemy? How could the Imperium defend against threats that exploited its own strengths and virtues? These questions would soon prove academic, as events on multiple worlds reached critical thresholds simultaneously. The network's patient preparation was about to pay dividends as carefully laid plans activated across dozens of star systems. What had begun as subtle influence and gradual corruption was about to manifest as open reality warping phenomena that would challenge the very foundations of Imperial understanding about the nature of existence itself. The first signs appeared on worlds that had been classified as successfully cleansed of chaos influence. Populations that had undergone intensive purification procedures and been certified as loyal began displaying behaviors that defied every known model of human psychology and biology. The changes weren't random or chaotic. They followed patterns that seemed to serve purposes that transcended individual consciousness or even species' survival instincts. On these worlds, the boundaries between individual identity and collective consciousness began to dissolve in ways that created new forms of existence that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of sentient life. The transformation wasn't destructive in any conventional sense. It represented an evolution towards something that might have been considered superior if it hadn't served the interests of humanity's greatest enemy. As we prepare to examine the final phase of this investigation, we must confront the most disturbing possibility of all, that the corruption network's ultimate goal isn't the destruction of imperial civilization, but its transformation into something that serves the Dark Prince's purposes while retaining enough familiar elements to be accepted by populations that would resist obvious corruption. The implications of this possibility extend far beyond any single world or sector, threatening the very concept of human identity itself. The transformation that began on these worlds defied every classification system the Imperium possessed. What the network had achieved wasn't mere corruption in the traditional sense. It was the creation of hybrid forms of existence that retained human consciousness while operating according to principles that served Slaanesh's incomprehensible agenda. The affected populations didn't become mindless cultists or ravening demons. Instead, they evolved into something far more dangerous. Beings who genuinely believed they had discovered a superior way of existence. Dr. Lysander Vex, one of the few Imperial observers to witness these transformations firsthand before his own inevitable corruption, documented the process with clinical fascination that gradually gave way to horrified understanding. His initial reports described populations that seemed to have achieved perfect social harmony, eliminating conflict, want, and suffering through methods that appeared almost miraculous. The transformed communities operated with efficiency that surpassed even the most optimized imperial settlements. Crime had been eliminated not through enforcement, but through the apparent absence of criminal impulses. Productivity soared as workers found genuine fulfillment in tasks that had previously been sources of drudgery and resentment. Interpersonal relationships achieved levels of intimacy and understanding that made traditional human bonding seem crude and limited by comparison. What made these achievements so unsettling was their apparent authenticity. The transformed individuals weren't pretending to be happy or forcing themselves to be productive. They had genuinely transcended the limitations and frustrations that defined normal human existence. They experienced their work, their relationships, and their daily lives with an intensity of satisfaction that made their previous existence seem like a pale shadow of true living. The physical transformations that accompanied this psychological evolution were subtle at first, but became increasingly pronounced over time. The subjects developed enhanced sensory capabilities that allowed them to perceive beauty and meaning in phenomena that remained invisible to unaltered humans. Their emotional range expanded to encompass states of consciousness that had no names in any imperial language. More disturbing still was their ability to share these experiences directly with each other. The boundaries between individual consciousness became permeable in ways that allowed for forms sentient of intimate understanding that transcended anything possible within normal human psychology. They could experience each other's emotions, share memories, and even temporarily merge aspects of their personalities to create composite beings with capabilities that exceeded the sum of their components. These collective entities retained the memories and personalities of their constituent individuals while gaining access to knowledge and abilities that seemed to emerge from the merger itself. They could solve complex problems through methods that appeared intuitive but produced results that surpassed anything achievable through conventional analysis. They demonstrated understanding of technologies and concepts that none of the individual components had studied or encountered. The social structures that emerged from these capabilities were unlike anything in Imperial experience. Traditional hierarchies based on authority and specialization gave way to fluid networks where leadership and expertise shifted based on the specific needs of each situation. Decisions were made through processes that seemed to involve the entire community simultaneously, yet without the chaos and inefficiency that such collective decision-making normally produced. The community's relationship with their physical environment underwent equally dramatic transformation. Architecture began to change in response to the inhabitants' altered perceptions and needs. Buildings developed curves and proportions that enhanced the psychological effects of occupancy. Public spaces evolved to facilitate the types of group activities that had become central to the transformed culture. Even more remarkably, the local ecosystem began to adapt to serve the community's expanded sensory capabilities. Plants developed new varieties of flowers. Grasses were whose colors and aura calibrated to enhance specific emotional states. Local wildlife exhibited behavioral changes that created natural symphonies and visual displays that complemented the community's daily rhythms. The technological innovations that emerged from these communities represented leaps in capability that seemed to violate known principles of scientific development. They created devices that responded to thought and emotion rather than physical manipulation. They developed materials that adapted their properties based on the psychological state of their users. Most impressively, they achieved forms of communication that transcended the limitations of language and transmitted meaning directly from consciousness to consciousness. These advances weren't the result of research programs or deliberate invention. They seemed to emerge spontaneously from the community's collective unconscious. Individuals would wake with complete knowledge of new techniques or technologies that they couldn't explain but could implement with perfect precision. The innovations built upon each other in ways that suggested a coherent development plan that existed beyond the awareness of any individual contributor. Dr. Vex's later reports described his growing realization that he was witnessing the emergence of a new form of human civilization that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The transformed communities retained recognizable human values like cooperation, creativity, and the pursuit of beauty. But these values had been fundamentally redefined in ways that served purposes he couldn't comprehend. The inhabitants spoke of experiences that seemed to involve contact with entities existing in dimensions beyond normal space-time. They described receiving guidance and inspiration from sources they couldn't identify but trusted implicitly. Their artwork and literature began to incorporate symbols and concepts that had no precedent in human culture but possessed an undeniable aesthetic power that affected even unaltered observers. Most unsettling of all was the community's attitude toward their transformation. They didn't see themselves as corrupted or lost. They saw themselves as having awakened to possibilities that had always existed, but remained hidden from ordinary human perception. They spoke with genuine compassion about the limitations of unaltered humanity, while expressing confidence that everyone would eventually undergo similar evolution. Their proselytizing wasn't aggressive or coercive. It was patient and subtle. They would demonstrate the benefits of their transformation through their actions and achievements, allowing observers to draw their own conclusions about the desirability of joining them. They seemed confident that anyone who spent sufficient time in their communities would eventually choose transformation voluntarily. This confidence proved well-founded, as Imperial investigation teams found themselves increasingly drawn to the transformed communities despite their training and preparation. The investigators would arrive with clear mission parameters and strong psychological defenses, but prolonged exposure to the community's achievements and lifestyle gradually eroded their resistance. The transformation process for these investigators followed predictable patterns that suggested the communities possessed sophisticated understanding of Imperial psychology and training methods. Rather than attacking the investigators' beliefs directly, they would provide experiences that gradually expanded their conception of what was possible and desirable. An investigator might find themselves invited to witness a community decision-making process that achieved consensus on complex issues in minutes rather than hours or days. They might be shown technologies that solved problems they hadn't realized could be addressed. They might experience forms of art or entertainment that created emotional responses more intense and satisfying than anything in their previous experience. Each exposure would be followed by periods of reflection where the investigators could process what they had witnessed without pressure or coercion. The communities seemed to understand that forced conversion was less stable and effective than transformation that resulted from genuine conviction and desire for change. The investigators' reports during this process showed a gradual shift from clinical observation to personal engagement. Their language became more appreciative and less judgmental. They began to ask questions about the possibility of bringing these innovations to other Imperial worlds, rather than focusing solely on threat assessment and containment recommendations. By the time the investigators realized they were being transformed, the process had usually progressed too far to reverse. They would find themselves reluctant to leave the communities even when their mission parameters called for immediate extraction. They would begin to question the wisdom of Imperial policies that prevented populations from accessing the benefits they had witnessed. The final stage typically involved a moment of crisis where the investigators had to choose between their duty to the Imperium and their desire to remain in the transformed communities. Those who chose transformation would experience rapid psychological and physical changes that integrated them fully into the community structure within days or weeks. Those who attempted to resist or escape often found themselves pursued by entities that seemed to emerge from their own subconscious minds. The communities didn't send physical agents to retrieve them. Instead, they experienced psychological pressure that manifested as intense longing for the experiences and relationships they were leaving behind. The few investigators who successfully escaped and returned to Imperial space brought reports that challenged every assumption about the nature of chaos corruption. The transformed communities weren't writhing in madness or decay. They appeared to represent improvements in human potential and genuine social organization. The corruption had learned to make itself genuinely attractive rather than simply SE development ductive. This represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the threat facing the Imperium. Previous chaos corruption had been relatively easy to identify and oppose because it was obviously destructive and malevolent. The new form of corruption presented benefits that seemed genuine and positive, making resistance appear not just difficult, but potentially irrational. Imperial doctrine provided no clear guidance for dealing with corruption that improved rather than degraded human capabilities. The standard response of purification through fire and sword seemed not just excessive, but actively harmful when applied to populations that had achieved unprecedented levels of peace, productivity, and happiness. The theological implications were equally troubling. If the Dark Prince could create forms of existence that appeared superior to baseline humanity, what did that suggest about the Emperor's plan for human development? Were the transformed communities representing forbidden evolution that challenged divine will? Or were they examples of potential that the Imperium had failed to recognize and develop? These questions became more than academic when similar transformations began appearing on worlds throughout Imperial space. The pattern wasn't random. It followed the network of influence that had been established through decades of subtle manipulation. Worlds that had been classified as secure and loyal began manifesting the same phenomena simultaneously. The speed and coordination of these manifestations suggested that the network had been preparing for this moment for generations. Every piece of subtle corruption, every compromised system, every unwitting collaborator had been part of a vast preparation for a transformation event that would challenge the Imperium's ability to maintain control over its own populations. The affected worlds didn't declare independence or launch military campaigns against Imperial authority. Instead, they simply began operating according to principles that made Imperial governance increasingly irrelevant. They developed technologies that eliminated scarcity, social structures that prevented conflict, and forms of consciousness that transcended the limitations that made Imperial control necessary. Local administrators found themselves managing populations that no longer needed management. Military commanders discovered that their forces were no longer required for maintaining order. Ecclesiarchy preachers faced congregations that had found forms of spiritual fulfillment that made traditional worship seem primitive and inadequate. The Imperium's response to these developments was hampered by the difficulty of defining exactly what was wrong with the situation. The affected worlds continued to meet their tithe obligations, maintained civil order, and posed no direct threat to neighboring systems. They simply no longer functioned according to the assumptions that underpinned Imperial civilization. Traditional methods of dealing with chaos corruption proved ineffective because the transformed populations genuinely didn't want to be saved. They had experienced forms of existence that made their previous lives seem impoverished and limited. Attempts to restore them to baseline humanity were met with incomprehension rather than resistance. The most disturbing aspect of this development was its apparent irreversibility. Populations that had undergone the transformation showed no signs of degradation or corruption in the conventional sense. If anything, they seemed to become more stable and harmonious over time. The changes appeared to represent a permanent evolution rather than a temporary alteration. Military intervention faced the problem that the transformed populations posed no direct threat and often seemed genuinely concerned for the welfare of Imperial forces sent to contain them. They would attempt to demonstrate the benefits of their transformation rather than fighting to preserve it. Their confidence in the superiority of their condition made them more interested in conversion than conquest. The psychological impact on Imperial forces exposed to these demonstrations was devastating. Soldiers trained to fight obvious enemies found themselves confronting populations that seemed to represent everything the Imperium claimed to offer, but had never actually achieved. The cognitive dissonance created by this situation broke down unit cohesion and mission focus with alarming speed. Several immense, simply entire reg abandoned their positions and integrated themselves into the transformed communities. Others returned to Imperial space carrying seeds of doubt and dissatisfaction that spread through their home units like a psychological contagion. The very act of witnessing the transformation seemed to create vulnerability to its influence. The Inquisition's attempts to contain information about these developments only partially succeeded. Rumors and speculation spread through Imperial communication networks, faster than official censorship could suppress them. Populations throughout the galaxy began to wonder whether they were missing opportunities for improvement and fulfillment that the Imperium was deliberately denying them. This growing curiosity created exactly the psychological conditions that the corruption network needed to expand its influence. Worlds that had never been directly contacted by Slaaneshi agents began experiencing spontaneous transformations as populations unconsciously recreated the conditions they had heard described in rumors and fragmented reports. The phenomenon seemed to be approaching a critical threshold where it would become self-sustaining and unstoppable. Each new transformation provided examples and inspiration for others, creating a cascade effect that threatened to sweep across Imperial space like a wave of evolution that would fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization. As we approach the culmination of this investigation, we must confront the possibility that what we're witnessing isn't simply corruption in any traditional sense, but the emergence of a new phase in human development that happens to serve the interests of humanity's greatest enemy. The question facing the Imperium is whether this transformation represents a threat to be destroyed or an evolution to be understood and potentially controlled. The answer to that question will determine not just the fate of the affected worlds, but the future of human civilization itself. For if the servants of Slaanesh have indeed discovered methods for genuinely improving human existence, then the Imperium must either find ways to provide similar benefits through loyal means, or risk losing entire populations to corruption that offers what Imperial doctrine promises but has never delivered. The final phase of this cosmic chess game is about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Everything humanity has built, everything it believes about itself and its destiny, hangs in the balance as the Dark Prince's ultimate gambit reveals its true scope and ambition. The crescendo of this galactic nightmare reached its peak when the corruption network activated dormant protocols that had been embedded in Imperial infrastructure for centuries. What appeared to be spontaneous transformations were actually the culmination of preparation so thorough and patient that it defied human comprehension of strategic planning. The first indication of coordinated activation came through anomalous readings in astropathic communication networks across 17 sectors. Messages that should have taken weeks to traverse the warp were arriving instantaneously. More disturbing still, astropaths began reporting that they were receiving communications they hadn't sent, as if the warp itself was completing their thoughts and broadcasting intentions they hadn't fully formed. These psychic anomalies weren't random disturbances. Analysis revealed patterns that suggested the emergence of a metaconsciousness that encompassed multiple star systems. Individual astropaths were becoming components de-mined, that of a distributor operated across galactic distances without regard for the normal limitations of space and time. The phenomenon manifested differently, follow on each world, but underlying principles that created complementary effects. Agri-worlds began producing crops with properties that enhanced consciousness expansion in those who consumed them. Forge worlds developed manufacturing processes that incorporated materials with reality-altering properties into seemingly mundane products. Hive worlds became focal points for psychic resonance that amplified and transmitted the transformation effects to neighboring systems. What made this coordination possible was the network's mastery of what Imperial scholars termed ontological engineering. Rather than simply corrupting existing reality, they had learned to alter the fundamental rules that governed how reality operated in specific locations. These alterations were subtle enough to avoid triggering the automatic defenses that protected normal space from warp intrusion. but comprehensive enough to create zones where different forms of existence became possible. The engineering wasn't crude reality manipulation like that employed by lesser chaos sorcerers. It represented sophisticated understanding of the relationship between consciousness, matter, and the underlying structure of existence itself. The network had apparently spent millennia developing techniques for introducing controlled modifications to local space-time that would support the forms of life they wanted to create. These modifications began at the quantum level, altering the probability matrices that determined how particles interacted with each other. Small changes in fundamental constants created cascading effects that influenced molecular behavior, cellular development, and ultimately consciousness itself. The affected regions remained stable and functional, but operated according to physical laws that permitted phenomena impossible in normal imperial space. The inhabitants of these regions found themselves able to perceive and manipulate aspects of reality that remained hidden from unaltered humans. They could sense the emotional resonances of objects and locations. They could influence probability through focused intention. They could communicate through methods that transcended language and transmitted meaning directly from mind to mind. These capabilities weren't random gifts bestowed by chaotic corruption. They represented systematic enhancement of human potential along specific vectors that served the network's broader objectives. Each new ability made the subjects more valuable as components of the distributed consciousness, while simultaneously making them less compatible with baseline human society. The enhanced individuals began to display collective behaviors that suggested they were operating according to instructions that existed beyond their individual awareness. They would undertake projects that seemed pointless from local perspectives, but created infrastructure and resources that served purposes spanning multiple worlds and generations. Construction projects would begin simultaneously on worlds that had no contact with each other, yet the completed structures would form geometric patterns visible only from interstellar distances. Agricultural modifications would produce crops that seemed designed for consumption by beings with different digestive systems than baseline humans. Research programs would develop technologies that addressed problems that wouldn't become apparent for decades. The scope and coordination required for such activities indicated that the network possessed not just galactic reach, but temporal awareness that allowed it to plan and execute strategies across centuries. They weren't simply responding to current conditions, but actively shaping future possibilities to align with their long-term objectives. Imperial strategists struggled to comprehend planning horizons that extended beyond human lifespans. Every tactical and strategic doctrine assumed that enemy planning operated within time frames that made sense for mortal minds. The network's ability to coordinate activities across generations made conventional military responses largely irrelevant. Traditional concepts of victory and defeat became meaningless when facing an opponent that measured success in geological timescales. Individual battles and campaigns were simply data points in calculations that encompassed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. The network could afford to lose worlds, fleets, and populations because these losses were factored into plans that would achieve their objectives, regardless of short-term setbacks. The psychological impact of this realization on Imperial commanders was devastating. How could human determination and sacrifice matter when measured against an enemy that planned in millennia? How could the Imperium's greatest victories be anything more than minor inconveniences to beings that viewed the entire span of human history as a brief episode in their eternal schemes? These questions became more than philosophical when the network began demonstrating its temporal capabilities directly. Events that had been recorded as historical victories for Imperial forces were revealed to have been carefully orchestrated to serve the network's purposes. Heroes whose deeds had inspired generations were shown to have been manipulated into actions that ultimately advanced Chaos objectives. The corruption of historical narrative struck at the foundations of Imperial identity. If past triumphs were actually defeats, if legendary figures were unwitting puppets, if sacred traditions were contaminated from their inception, then what remained of the civilization that humanity had built? The very stories that gave meaning to Imperial existence became weapons turned against the share populations that ished them. Worse still, the network began altering these historical records in real time through methods that seemed to involve retroactive manipulation of cause that had been witness reality itself. Events studied by millions would be subtly modified in ways that made theations seem alternatural and inevitable. Memory itself became the past unreliable, as was rewritten to support present objectives. Scholars and historians found their own records, and themselves unable to trust, and recollections. Documents change overnight, sometimes sting to their rever and original formed, then changing again in ways that suggested someone ending with different experiment versions of history. The boundary between what had actually happened and what the network wanted to have happened began to dissolve. These temporal manipulations weren't random or chaotic. They followed patterns that suggested the network was conducting systematic experiments to determine which historical the modifications would produce most favorable outcomes for their current operations. Past events were being treated as variables in ongoing calculations rather than fixed points that constrained present possibilities. The implications for Imperial doctrine were catastrophic. Every precedent, every tradition, every lesson learned from past experience could potentially be invalidated by retroactive modification. Military strategies based on historical analysis became useless when the history itself was subject to change without notice. Religious faith faced even greater challenges as sacred texts and doctrinal foundations shifted in ways that altered fundamental teachings. Passages that had provided comfort and guidance for generations would suddenly contain different meanings that supported conclusions contradictory to established belief. The very words of the Emperor seemed to be mutable, subject to revision by forces that operated beyond the reach of human understanding. The Archy's attempts, Eccles to maintain doctrinal consistency through strict adherence to approved texts, failed when those texts themselves became unreliable. Priests would memorize passages only to find that the written versions, new elections, longer matched their congregations would notice changes in familiar prayers and hymns that their spiritual leaders couldn't explain or acknowledge. This erosion of textual authority created opportunities for alternative interpretations that served the network's purposes. New readings of ancient doctrines would emerge that seemed to support cooperation with the transformed communities. Theological arguments would develop that suggested the changes represented divine evolution rather than heretical corruption. The most insidious aspect of these doctrinal modifications was their apparent improvement of existing teachings. The altered texts often contained insights and wisdom that surpassed their original versions. They addressed questions and concerns that the original doctrines had left unresolved. They provided comfort and guidance that seemed more relevant to contemporary challenges than the traditional teachings. Believers found themselves in the impossible position of choosing between textual fidelity and spiritual satisfaction. The modified doctrines offered more complete answers to life's fundamental questions, But accepting them meant acknowledging that their faith had been built on incomplete or inferior foundations, and so we reach the end of our descent into the abyss, having witnessed horrors that defy every assumption about the nature of corruption and the boundaries of human experience. What we've uncovered isn't merely another chaos cult or demon world outbreak, but evidence of a transformation so profound and systematic that it challenges the very foundations of what it means to be human in the 41st millennium. The servants of Slaanesh have achieved something far more terrifying than simple destruction or obvious corruption. They've created a form of existence that appears genuinely superior to baseline humanity while serving the interests of the Dark Prince. They've demonstrated that corruption need not be repulsive to be absolute, that damnation can wear the mask of transcendence, and that the greatest threats to human civilization may come disguised as its salvation. The network we've examined spans not just worlds but centuries, operating with patience and sophistication that makes our greatest strategic minds seem like children playing with toy soldiers. They've learned to corrupt not just individuals, but the very systems designed to protect against corruption. They've turned our strengths into weapons against us, our virtues into vulnerabilities, and our most loyal servants into unwitting agents of our destruction. Perhaps most disturbing of all, they've shown that reality itself is far more malleable than imperial doctrine admits. The boundaries between what is possible and what is forbidden aren't fixed laws of nature, but negotiable parameters that can be altered by those with sufficient knowledge and will. The transformation events we've witnessed represent not just corruption, but evolution, not just change, but metamorphosis into forms of existence that may indeed be superior to what humanity has achieved under imperial rule. The questions this investigation raises have no comfortable answers. If Slaanesh can offer genuine improvements to human existence, what does that say about the Emperor's vision for humanity? If corruption can make people happier, more productive, and more fulfilled than imperial citizenship, then what justifies the continued existence of our civilization? If the price of remaining human is eternal suffering, while the reward for transformation is transcendent bliss, then who are we really serving by resisting? These are the questions that keep inquisitors awake in the small hours of the night, staring into the darkness and wondering if they're fighting for humanity's salvation or its stagnation. They're the doubts that gnaw at the foundations of faith and duty, whispering that perhaps the real heresy lies not in embracing change, but in clinging to a system that promises everything and delivers only endless war and misery. The network's ultimate victory may not require conquering a single world or corrupting a single soul. It may be achieved simply by demonstrating that alternatives exist, that the suffering and limitations that define human existence aren't inevitable, but choices imposed by those who benefit from maintaining the status quo. The most dangerous weapon in their arsenal isn't plague or sword, but the simple question, what if there's a better way? And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that question burns brighter than any star, more terrifying than any daemon, more seductive than any promise of power or pleasure. For in asking it, we take the first step down a path that leads away from everything we've ever known, and towards something that might be paradise, or might be the ultimate corruption of everything we hold sacred. So, the choice, as always, remains ours to make. But having seen what we've seen, having learned what we've learned, can any of us ever truly claim ignorance again? The servants of Slaanesh have shown us their hand, and it's more beautiful and terrible than we ever dared imagine. In the end, that may be the most perfect corruption of all, not forcing us to fall, but simply showing us how far we might rise if only we had the courage to let go of what we think we are and embrace what we might become. The investigation ends, but the questions remain. And in the silence that follows, we're left to wonder if the real horror isn't what we've discovered about our enemies, but what we've learned about ourselves and the fragile nature of the reality. We've spent 10,000 years defending against the darkness that calls to us from beyond the veil.